Hey, lovely writers. My name is Brooke Adams Law. Welcome to my channel. Every month I host an author interview, and today my special guest is the New York Times bestselling author Ariel Lawhon. Her most recent book is Name Helene, which is one of my favorite books of 2020. Codename Helene is based on the thrilling true life story of Nancy Wake, the socialite spy who became one of the most powerful leaders of the French resistance during World War II. Nancy Wake was known for her signature red lipstick and her ability to summon weapons straight from the Allied forces. It is such a good book, you guys. And this conversation was so exciting. So as we get started, I want to hear from you. What was your favorite book of 2020? I would love if you shared below in the comments. And without further ado, here is my conversation with Ariel. All right. So welcome, Ariel. I'm so excited to have you here. Yay.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, first of all, I just want to say I adored Codename Helene, and it was one of my favorite books of 2020, and I read a lot. So, it's like really fun. And I first heard about it on the What Should I Read Next podcast with Anne Bogle, who I think is a friend of yours. She mentioned that she
Yes.
had read it early, so that's like super fun. And I have like single-handedly sold, I think, at least like 15 copies of this
Oh,
book
that makes me
because,
happy.
yeah, because I shared it with a bunch of friends, and then a few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to be a guest author on a book club that read my book, and they were like, "What should we read next?" So I asked them like a few questions about like what kinds of books they liked, and I was like, "You should read Codename Helene," and I told them a little about it, and they were like, "Done, like we're sold." So I was like, "Perfect." So super fun. And I wanted to start off and just talk a little about how you decided to write this book. So I know you said in the author's note that you have a friend, Sally Burgess, who was like, if you don't write about Nancy Wake next, we can no longer be friends. And then you didn't, right? You wrote I Was Anastasia instead. But then when you started looking into Nancy Wake, you were like, I found it. Like, I know this is my next book. So I would love to hear, like, what is that moment of knowing, like, when you come
Yeah.
across kind of the person that you know you're going to write about next?
Yeah, absolutely. Although first I have to say, my friend Sally, who is my oldest friend's mother,
So
I've
fun.
known her forever. She now takes full credit for everything. She believes pretty much that she wrote the book, so she's very
Yeah.
pleased. That moment of knowing has actually happened all four times with all of my books, and it happened with the one that I'm working on now. I'm looking at the wall kind of behind my computer because that's where all my notes are for my upcoming book.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to describe it other than all the little hairs stand up on the back of my neck. I will be going about my business, not looking for new ideas, and I'll find something, an idea. Most of the time, it's some random rabbit trail on the internet. I've gotten distracted when I should be working, and I find this
Distracted.
idea, and my whole body goes, oh, that's interesting. And literally along the back of my neck, all the little hairs stand up. And what I do is I write it down and I put it in my file for good ideas. And
Mm-hmm.
the file is loaded with good ideas.
Yeah.
And from that point on, there's this really interesting thing that happens because I try to ignore the idea. My goal is to not write that idea. I have more good ideas than I'll ever be able to write in one career. So I'm trying to get rid of them, get them out of my mind.
Yeah.
But inevitably, the one starts to haunt me. And
Yes.
I call it the red dress theory. So the thinking is you go to a cocktail party, there's all these beautiful women in black cocktail dresses, but
Mm-hmm.
it's the girl who walks in with the red dress that gets all the attention because she's different. And
Mm-hmm.
inevitably, in that file of ideas that I have, one of them is wearing a red dress and one of them is constantly begging for attention.
Oh my
So
gosh,
I
I love it.
typically know I'm ready to commit when it's that one idea that I cannot stop thinking about.
Oh my
And that's what
gosh.
happened with Nancy. I was most of the way through writing I Was Anastasia, and I kept seeing these little glimpses of her life because I'd researched her just a little bit to see if this was even worth putting in the folder, and it definitely
Mm-hmm.
was. And in that little bit of research, there were just things that she did, jumping out of an airplane or killing a Nazi with her bare hands. And she began to intrude as I was writing Anastasia. And then I was pretty much like, okay, sold, we're done.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I love that so much. So I would love to hear a little bit about like how you approach the research process. So I write contemporary fiction and like there's like research that goes into like whatever topic or like plot line that comes across, but like I can talk to people who were there, like I have like access, right? So I'm
Right.
so curious about this layer of like, okay, you're now writing about a place maybe you've never been, about a time you've never been. People may or may not still be alive. So how do you like even start thinking about it and like what is your research process like?
Great question. The way that I always explain it is everyone ends their formal education with these massive gaps, right? There's no way to go through the educational process system and learn everything. In my case, I feel like there were some extraordinarily large gaps. And writing historical fiction has been my way as an adult to fill them. Every book I have undertaken has been about a different place and time, a different part of the world, a different person. So I had to become an expert on jazz era New York City. I had to become an expert on Zeppelins, these massive flying, floating hotels, basically. I had to become an expert on the Russian Revolution. I had to become an expert on not just World War II, but a specific theater of World War II, which was the French Resistance.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating to me. I love learning, and I often like the research better than the writing itself. Writing is hard. You have to do some massive effort. With research, it's intake. I get to take all this stuff in and I get to learn and be distracted. But inevitably, whenever I finally commit to an idea, I have this moment sort of, oh crap, I know nothing about that. I literally know nothing about the French Resistance or the Russian Revolution. And I have to begin this long process of gathering information that is, I've learned my lesson, not just gathering information, because you could gather information forever. I have to gather information that is pertinent to my character during the years that I'm writing about. Otherwise, I mean, the brain just can't hold all the other information. Yeah. And then I begin reading and I begin reading and I read and I read and I read. And actually, I'm going to jump up real quick. Hope it doesn't ruin your video, but I can show you one of the research books that I used for Helene and all my notes and highlights to illustrate. Hold that thought.
Do it.
Okay, I'm here still, I promise. I'm just going to grab one. But this kind of shows you visually how I approach the process. So there are 4 different colored sticky notes in this. I believe it might be 5. Anyway, 1 color sticky note for each portion of the book.
Oh, nice.
I never get my books from the library because I do horrible things to them. I deface them constantly. But I do this because I need to know where I found a detail, where I found my information. Yep. And I'll read a book and I'm highlighting and I'm underlining. Some of it's pertinent dates and information and heavier research stuff, but most of it, things that interest me personally. Yeah. Nancy's little white dog, the fact that she would put on red lipstick before battle, the fact that the SOE would send her these little shipments, these little care packages while she was out in the woods. Those are all things that I found fascinating. And then when I'm done plotting out the actual timeline of the story, I will go back and I will look at all these little notes and I'll gather them and I'll begin to build them into the story because my assumption is, I could be wrong, those little details give life to a story. And if it's that interesting to me, there's a decent chance it's going to be that interesting to the reader as well. And that is how you kind of slowly over time begin building this character on the page. You start with nothing and you end up with something. And the process for me is a lot of reading, a lot of research, and a lot of gathering little details that make the story come alive.
I love this so much, and I just want to affirm your guess that the details you find interesting are like the details other people find interesting. Because I was just telling a friend the other day about this interview, and I was like, "Oh, Nancy Wake," and I talked about the red lipstick and how like she would like order all these like weapons right from the Allied forces, and then she'd be like, "And like I would love more red lipstick or like some soap or like whatever," right? And they would send her like her own little thing, which I just thought was
I
brilliant.
have talked to a couple men who read the book, and one of them was like, listen, you almost lost me in that first scene where she stops to put on lipstick before she jumps out of a plane. But I've read a couple of your other books, and I know you don't put stuff in there just for frills.
Mm,
Like, listen, I don't. And that's not the kind of thing that I would personally make up. But
mm,
it really happened. And over time, as the novel goes on, that silly detail about lipstick begins to really illuminate her personality and her character. And you begin to see how it really is armor.
mm.
And I started wearing it in my life. And if I had a meeting, if one trip to the principal's office comes to mind, anytime I have to do something and I feel like I need an extra layer of confidence, I will put on a layer of red lipstick. And it works. And I cannot tell you how many women I have heard from since this book was published that was like, oh my gosh, I started wearing red lipstick because of Nancy Wake.
Oh, I love that so much. I was literally thinking, but when I was getting ready, I was like, I should have worn. I don't have red lipstick, but I was like, I might have to get some now, like just because of this. So I can totally relate to that. I love it so much, and
I
I
don't
love
want
that
to.
um, this piece about like I read an interview one time with an actress, and I can't remember who. I can't remember who it was. It was somebody of like Meryl Streep level caliber. It wasn't Meryl Streep herself, but somebody in that like echelon, and they were talking about how characters that they've played on screen become like women they've known, and they almost have these like traits that they will like then like take on like when they need them. So I love what you just said about like that this piece of Nancy has like stayed with you, that like whenever you need some confidence, right, you use that her trait of putting on red lipstick. So I love that so much, of like that the people we write about or as an actor like play like sort of become part of who we are because we spend so much time with them. Like that makes total sense to me.
I mean, I read an article once that said the human mind cannot differentiate between somebody you know in real life and spend time with and a character on the page that you know and spend time with, which I think is why series like Outlander or the Louise Penny novels, some of these really long running series, to those avid readers, those characters are real because they've spent years getting to know them. Maybe not as real as your husband or your kids or your siblings, but the mind believes that you know that person. And so for me, I'm very protective of my characters. If I hear somebody writing about one of them later, I'm kind of like, fine.
I love that so much because so my first book came out in October, and like the day like the thank you. The day it came out, I was like an emotional wreck. Like I was like crying on the couch, and I was like, what is happening to me right now? So I was talking to a friend the next day, and she was kind of like, there's this piece like, so my book was like, there were many things that happened along the way, but it was like 13 years from like the day that I had the idea to like the day that it came out. And like I was talking to this friend, and she was like, do you worry about your characters like being out in the world, right? Like all this time that you've spent like kind of one-on-one with them. And I realized there was like this element that was really true of like, she said, she was like, it sounds almost like you're sending the kids off to college, and you're like, good luck out in the world. Like, like it's kind of like, I hope people are nice to you, right? So I can totally relate to that
Well,
as
and
well.
there's this element too where you have to share them for a
Yes,
large
yes.
chunk. Really, when it's just me in my office, when I'm sitting in this room, it's just me. I don't even let my editor or my agent read anything until
Yeah.
I feel very confident about it. It drives them crazy. It protects I protect my workspace, right? This is the
Yes,
workspace. I have
yes.
to protect it. So there's a long stretch of time where it's just me. It's me in the story. It's me in the book. It's just the two of us. And then that first time I hit send and I'm inviting someone else in, they're going to have feedback. Most of the time it's great feedback, but it doesn't matter. That's the moment that it stops being completely mine.
Yep.
And then the moment it gets published and goes out into the world, it is no longer mine at all. I have no ownership over that story at any point. It is between the story and the reader and whatever relationship they form. And sometimes my readers hate the book and they will let me know all about it.
Oh,
Sometimes
great.
they love it, but at that point, it's theirs. It's not
Yeah.
mine anymore. So there's this almost this element of grief that goes along with that as well, because you have to surrender the thing you've given so much of yourself to.
Yeah. I love that so much. Thank you for speaking to that. So, I want to go back to, so we were talking about your research process, and I'm curious about like at what point, because you spoke about like you have the different color stickies and the different color highlights to kind of go with each part of the book. And so Codename Helene is structured according to these interweaving timelines with her 4 different code names during the war, which I thought was brilliant. So did you know, like at what point did you know like this is the structure? Was that like from the very beginning? Like do you know how the book is going to be structured first? And do you write kind of like through, or do you write like one timeline at a time? Like how do you kind of go about the structuring outlining the
That
piece?
is an excellent question. And it's one actually that my writer friends and I discuss a lot. I don't know how anyone else does it. I am only competent, barely competent in my own process. So we always say that there's 2 kinds of writers. There's the plotter, the one who
Yes.
sits down and plans everything out and knows where everything is going from day one. And then there's the pantser, the one who writes by the seat of their pants and they sit down at the computer and it's like they're exploring and they don't know where anything's going until the character goes. I'm not that kind of person. I could never write by the seat of my pants. I think it's because for so many years I was writing. I had 4 children in 5 years. So for a good decade, my writing life was spent during nap times, nights, and weekends. And I couldn't lose that work. I couldn't only have 20 minutes to work one day and then open the scene the next day and realize I have to delete it. It doesn't work. That was demoralizing. So I started plotting out what came next. And it stuck and it really, really works well for me. So, one of the very first things that I decide is the structure of the book.
Nice.
All of mine have had a different structure. I think of it as a shape, right? There's this,
Yes.
I can't describe it as any other way than a shape. With my first novel, it's called The Wife, the Maid, and the Mistress. It's kind of based on the true story of a New York State Supreme Court judge who went missing in 1930. And it's told from the perspective of his wife, his maid, and his mistress. All of them know what happened to him. All of them choose not to tell for different reasons. So in my mind, that story was this braid. I was braiding these 3 narratives together, and you were only getting pieces at a time. With my second novel, it's called Flight of Dreams, and it's set during the last ill-fated flight of the Hindenburg. The whole story takes place over 3.5 days. And they're on this airship flying over the Atlantic Ocean. It's this locked box, compressed time. There's literally a ticking clock.
Yeah.
Every part of the story begins 18 hours until the explosion or whatever. So it was this locked box. With Anastasia, I thought of it as a double helix. It's these 2 women's stories, and you're trying to figure out, is Anna Anderson really Anna or Anastasia? And these 2 strands were similar. They were woven together, inseparable. And then with Codename Helene, to me, it was a circle. And not to give anything away, but the way the first scene of the novel and the last scene of the novel are a complete circle.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was writing Helene, I was constantly going, oh my gosh, the circle is still there. There'd be these full circle moments. You would meet one character in one timeline that she's known, let's say, for 8 years. But then 20 chapters later, you would see them meet for the first time because one narrative starts when she's jumping out of the airplane. The next one, the next chapter really starts 8 years before. And the idea was to figure out how a woman could go from being a young journalist sent off to interview Adolf Hitler for one of her first newspaper jobs to becoming the kind of woman that could kill a Nazi with her bare hands. How does that woman become this woman? And the best way that I could figure that out was to alternate back and forth and let one of them catch up to the other, so that by the time you get to Nancy jumping out of that airplane, you see how the transformation has happened. And it's fun for me. That's the really, really fun part. I like to figure out the best structure to tell the story, not to be tricksy, not to try to be clever, but to figure out, I have this story. I want it to be surprising. I want it to be engaging. What is the best way to tell it?
Mm-hmm.
And so
I
far, it's been a unique structure.
I love this so much, like the shape metaphor. I'm gonna like mull over that for a long time because like
I
and
would
how each
challenge
like the circle and the double helix, like I'm just like, oh my gosh, this is like I haven't heard anyone use that metaphor before, and it's really helpful to think about it because I think of like my writing as having shapes, but not in such like a literal like geometric kind of way, but like
you.
having more like an arc or like what's the pacing, like where does it need to be faster, slower, like all those pieces. So that's really
I would
helpful.
challenge you, whatever you're working on now, just jot down on a piece of paper what's the shape and try to figure
Mm.
out, because shape and structure to me really mean the same thing. But if I can
Mm-hmm.
get a very specific geometric shape, I have that constantly in my mind as I
Yes.
am working on it. The one I'm working on now, I think of as a Mobius strip. It's doing
Oh,
this, right?
cool. Uh-huh.
Constantly back and forth. And I couldn't start writing until I knew what that shape was.
Yep. So when you're like figuring out what the shape is, are you constantly like thinking about it? Are you like trying different shapes in your mind? Are you just like, does it just like pop into your head one day? Like you have like the red dress cocktail party? Like how does it come to you?
I So most of that is instinct. I think you just know. I
Mm.
really do
Hmm.
believe that our subconscious minds are working on our behalf
Yes.
all the time.
Yes.
It's why you come up with really great ideas in the shower or when you're driving or you wake up in the middle of the night with this idea. Your subconscious mind doesn't stop. And so
Hmm.
once I commit to an idea, my mind is off to the races always. And because I know that I need this shape before I can
Hmm.
begin, I'm trying to find it. I am
Yeah.
actively trying to find it. And sometimes it's absolutely natural. My first two books, The Braid and The Locked Box, those were the absolute obvious ways to tell that story.
Yep.
Every book since has gotten a little bit more challenging to find
Mm.
the most organic structure that I will also enjoy telling.
Mm.
I could have written Anastasia straight through. I
Hmm.
didn't. Half of it is chronological, half of it is told in reverse, and they kind of collide in the middle, and it's this brain bending thing. It nearly killed me to write, but I had fun, even though I wanted to die. And then Helene, it didn't take quite as long as Anastasia. I
Hmm.
started out again chronologically, and then I realized, oh my gosh, like there's no tension because for the first number of years she's falling in love, she's living in Marseille, she's marrying this rich French guy, which would be awesome to live,
Yeah.
maybe not all that interesting to read. And so the challenge
Mm.
was, how do I keep people turning the page? And the obvious answer was, what is one of the most dramatic events in the book? Answer, she jumps out of an airplane into battle. Okay, if I start there,
Hmm.
how do I tell it? And how do I get all this stuff beforehand?
Mm, yes, and like the lovely, like perhaps even unintended consequence of that shape is like you're like in these really intense war-torn scenes where she's sleeping in the bus or on the ground, right? But then you have these lovely interludes, right, where she's with her husband and they get the little dog and like they're like, living this like luxurious life. And it almost kind of gives you a break a little bit as a reader of being like, oh, like she at least has these memories to look back on, right? Like there's kind of like a little bit of a reprieve like from all
Yeah,
of the intensity.
which I realized kind of after the fact was incredibly helpful with this particular story because it's World War
Mm.
II. It's
Yeah.
hard. There were
Yeah.
some really, really horrific things that happened in the book, and I didn't make those up. Those are things that Nancy lived with and dealt with
Mm.
and had to endure.
Yeah.
But to be able to switch again and then, I don't know, she's on her honeymoon or even just learning to ride a bike or drink,
Yes.
cuss like a sailor, these various things that her husband taught her. It was this balance. And I also loved that she was so funny and she really was hilarious. And so
Mm-hmm.
you've got this really dark story sometimes that has a lot of teeth.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's all this levity. And I would
Yes.
sit there, I'm like, oh my gosh, I just killed somebody in the last chapter. But now I'm laughing hysterically because she said something or she's insulted someone or she's said exactly the kind of thing I always wish that I could say if I could figure out the right retort.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes. So I do want to ask you about so there are some really intense scenes in this book, and I'm like very sensitive to like torture and like start. So like there are parts where I'd be like, okay, I'm just gonna I would like skim through like a little bit and kind of like get a sense of what was going on. And there were parts that I couldn't always like go all the way and read like every word. So I'm curious for you, like as a writer, like how do you go into some of these really dark scenes, and like how do you come back afterwards and like not let it kind of affect your day-to-day life, if that makes
So
sense, or
great.
does it?
There are two that I'm thinking of that I think are the most horrific in the book. They
Yes.
almost happened. I think they kind of happened back to back, actually.
Yeah.
One is perpetrated by the Germans, one is actually perpetrated by the French resistance, and Nancy is
Yes.
present for both. Both of them really happened. Both of them she had to deal with in real life. The details were slightly different. I did have to kind of do some rearranging so that they would hit back to back. It is awful. I won't lie. It's
Yeah.
really, really horrible to sit there and write those things. And then I ask myself, I'm like, okay, if Nancy actually had to live this and she had to deal with it and the repercussions of these events, it's cowardly of me to just completely avoid it.
Mm.
And I, as awful as they are to read, I think we need to have them there for
Yes.
perspective of what they were actually facing in this challenge in a country overrun by odious, bloodthirsty men who wanted control of the world. And they had this small corner of that world they were trying to protect. And sometimes they won and sometimes they didn't. But the reality of losing for the people they loved and cared about was horrific.
Yeah.
And she had to fight that. That's the reality of what they were fighting. And I don't know that the story would be as meaningful as it is if those bits were sanitized.
Yes.
The
Agreed.
trick, however, as a writer is not to glorify
Mm-hmm.
some of these really awful things and or just to gosh be gross on the page. It's
Mm.
enough that it happened. So there's this balance, and that balance happens throughout the from drafting all the way through to editing and revisions. I sit there, and that's when I have to put my feelings aside and I have to become technical about it. And I will
Yeah.
be really specific with how long they are, how much dialogue there is, how much
Mm.
am I showing detail versus showing her reaction to things.
Yeah.
Then I get very, very specific with word choice and sort of emotional impact. And you have to be clinical. Otherwise, you can't get through it,
Yeah.
or you'll chicken out and not put it in there, which I
Mm-hmm.
have done on a number of occasions. There have been something that I was like, I need to put this there. And I'm like, oh, that's awful. I can't put it there. And I'm taking it out. And then
Yeah.
regretted it later.
Mm. Yeah. The word that you used of clinical is actually really helpful to me. So I work as a writing coach, and one of my clients is a doctor, and she's writing a memoir about her experience being a female doctor. She lives in the Midwest, so there's a lot of like, there's that piece of the experience. But she's talking about how, like, there's two sides for her. I think one side is like, um, you really do have to like there's that word of clinical of just like someone's bleeding, like their bones are poking through their skin, like I work in the ER, like I'm going to like fix it, right? And she also like tells stories about, and she's like, I know how to do this and I'm going to do it, right? And she also tells stories of like, for her, like she really wanted to be an OBGYN, and then she discovered that she could not, there were certain things like having children of her own that she was like, I cannot treat women with this condition, like I would just not be able, like I don't have the emotional capacity like to be able to do all the things that I would have to do. So like I'm going to go this other way, right? So there was kind of this ownership of like I can be clinical in the situations where it's called for, and also like I know my limits of like this is where like I won't go and this is where I will go, right? And we've been using that like even in telling stories like in her memoir of like where are the places where you have to like cut yourself off and like kind of pause your own emotion, and then like but also right, how do you turn it back on again? For her, like if she spends a 12-hour shift in that clinical place, right, she is a process of then like how do I come out of it and like almost unfreeze, right? So like it kind of lit that up for me of like that clinical piece.
Part of it too is it helps just to sit there and have an honest conversation with yourself before you write anything and go, okay,
Mm.
as a human being in this world, um, what am I uncomfortable with? What
Mm,
kinds of scenes will I not do? What kinds
yeah.
of words will I not use? I try to stay open to whatever tool I need because I think words are just tools. A word is a
Yep.
tool.
Yep.
But I do have boundaries of my own.
Hmm.
There's a woman in my life, a dear, dear, dear older woman that I love with my whole heart. And there are certain words that I know it would devastate her if I used. And it's
Hmm.
not that she is my conscience, but more a reminder that I don't write into a void. What I send
Hmm.
out into the world impacts people. So am I writing for shock value or am I
Hmm.
writing for emotional necessity? And it really forces me to ask questions of, can I tell this really hard, torturous scene without being unnecessarily graphic? How many
Yeah.
details can I include that you get the point without just horrifying you so much that you close the book?
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. And I love what you said too about like, because I was even saying like there are certain scenes that are harder for me to read, and there are certain scenes that are hard for other people, but like they don't bother me as much. So that's
Mhm.
interesting too. But this piece about where you said like we can't sanitize it out, right? So one of my other clients is a former African studies professor, and she's worked for like 20 years in Uganda. So she's writing about the aftermath of the LRA war, where like thousands, so like there's been a lot written about the child soldiers. There's been less written about the child wives. So these are like young girls that were kidnapped and like basically raped repeatedly for like 10 years. And so she is very conscious at the beginning that like she's like, we have enough books about the war, we don't have enough books about the aftermath of that war, and like how has this society started to like knit itself back together, and like how do people come back from that experience. And so that's what her book is about. And so we again have been like, we can't sanitize like what happened to this character, and also like we've been very careful about like, she's like, the book is about what happened when she came home, like it's not
Mhm.
about these years that she spent in the bush, right? And so like having that purpose and that frame is really helpful, like as we tease out like again like how graphic, how like what's the line that she's gonna walk. So yeah, it's helpful. It's like we need the story, and also like you said, how do we tell it without being overly graphic? So I think that's a
Right.
helpful question to ask. So okay. So I would love to hear a little bit about like, what do you do when you're stuck? Do you get stuck? Do you get stuck at the same point in a book? Is there often a point that's like really hard, or is it different with every book? Are there some that like flow all the way through? Like what happens when you're like, "Oh my god, I want to throw my computer
I
against the
actually wish
wall?"
one of my writing friends was here right now because she'd be like, oh my God, she's stuck all the time. And all she does is text me and complain. Every day I get stuck. Every day.
Okay.
Every day I want to put a fork in my eye and just be like, I'm over it. I quit. For me, having the plan is the most vital thing that I do. That is why
Mm,
I spend so much time up front researching,
yep.
plotting, and figuring out exactly where the story is going to go. Because if I sit down at the computer, let's say in an hour and a half, and I have to write a scene, and I'm like, eh, I hate myself, I hate the book, I hate the job, I hate everything. What I can then do is go, okay, it doesn't matter how you feel. What
Mm,
matters is getting words on the page. This is the next scene that has to come. Go ahead and get some bad words on the page, and you can fix it tomorrow
mm,
because I love the revision process. I
okay.
love making it better. So
Mm-hmm.
what I have started doing, particularly in the last couple of years, is I sit down to write, and if I'm not feeling it, which is most of the time because it's a
Mm,
job,
mm,
it's a passion, but it's also a job. When you
yeah.
sign the dotted line, it becomes I have to.
Mm,
Is I will look at the scene that I have to go. I'm like, okay, I'm going to write this scene and I'm going to do a favor for future Ariel. Future
mm,
Ariel gets to edit this mess and she's going to actually enjoy that process. Today's Ariel is just going to work for that. But when I sit down to write that scene, the first thing I do is I edit what I wrote yesterday. So I get
mm.
to start my writing session with the part I like, which is
Nice.
making something better. And
Yep.
then I end it with the more cognitively challenging work of creating something new. But by the time I get to the new part, my mind is already warmed up enough that I'm like, oh, okay, the words aren't going to be great, but I know where I'm going.
Yeah.
95% of the time, that fixes everything. I read the words the next day. I'm like, I wouldn't publish this right now, but it's not terrible. I can fix it.
Yep.
5% of the time, none of it works. 5% of the time, I am on fire and everything is bad. What I will do then is I will look at my list of scenes and I will find one that I'm really looking forward to writing. Sometimes it's, I don't know, like all those scenes in Helene where Nancy gets to tell off Gaspard and she just really gets to, like, there's the one scene where she makes him strip naked and throw all his clothes in the fire. It's ridiculous. It happened and it's really
So
fun.
yeah.
And I'm like, okay, let's go humiliate this big French guy in the forest.
Yeah.
And if you can find the scene that you're really looking forward to writing, the enthusiasm for that leaks onto the page.
Yeah.
And you do the same thing again tomorrow, and then the next day, and the next day, until you look up one day and you have a finished draft that is probably awful. Mine are. But again, I can fix it, and you get to work fixing it. And that's that's, I think, the rhythm of writing that many aspiring authors don't understand, is that you show up and you do the work, and then you show up and you do the work again, and you take it in these big chunks, and you accomplish the chapter, and then you accomplish the section, and then you accomplish the book, and you continue working on it. And sometimes it's really fun, and sometimes you're like, ugh, bad career choice.
Literally feels like pulling teeth. Well, and I love what you said about like even just the thought you have of like I can fix it, I think is a really useful thought. I think some of the writers that I work with get to this point of like it's so terrible it's not worth going on, right? They make it mean that like they're a terrible writer, and I'm just like, it's the whole thing of like all writing is rewriting, and it's like if you have the thought like, oh, I can fix this, like it makes everything feel much better.
Well, and knowing that you can fix it is also a process of breaking it down. So like when the draft is done, I will look at it and go, ooh, what is the worst chapter in this book?
Oh, nice.
And I will work on that chapter until I think it is the best chapter in the book. And then I repeat the process. But if a chapter is too big, even, you can look at a page and go, what's the worst paragraph here? Yep. I can identify the weakest paragraph on this page. Let me fix it until it's the best paragraph. And if you can just break it down into the smaller chunks and attack either the writing or the revision or any of it that way, it becomes this process that is doable. And I think most people, when they feel like, oh, I don't think I can fix it, it's because it's their first book or it's their first attempt at it. Once you've done it, it doesn't necessarily make the work any easier, but you go, oh, I've done this before. Yep. I can fix it.
Yep. Totally. I was just I'm working on an essay that's going to be included in an anthology in the fall. And it was really interesting. Well, so first of all, I am totally a pantser. I write by the seat of my pants. And I wish that that were not true about me. Like I have tried so hard to like plan and like plot things out. And then as soon as I sit down and start writing, I like something else happens and I'm like, oh God. But anyway, but like my writing is just, it comes out better that way. And again, I have like fought it long enough where I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna go with it.
Sorry, I had a kid walk in the door. I don't think it's worth fighting. I think one way or another. What I've always said, and I think if you acknowledge this up front, then you're fine, regardless of which path you choose. If you write like I do and you plot, like I don't begin writing until I know what happens throughout the whole book. Every scene that I write, I know how it comes with the one before and how it affects the one that comes after. But that's tremendous amounts of effort on the front end.
Yep.
But when I'm done with the book, I have very little editing, like story editing. Line editing and the smaller stuff, sure, everyone does. But my story changes very little once it's done. My friends that are pantsers, they have so much more fun writing. They sit down and everything's an exploration and they love their characters and they love their story and they get it done and they're like, oh crap, I have to rewrite half of this.
Yes.
Point being, you're going to suffer on the front end or you're going to suffer on the back end. You're going to suffer either way. It's going to be hard either way. You just pick where you want to do it. And I prefer to do as much suffering up front as I can.
Yes.
And then by the end, I'm like, this is awesome.
Yeah, I love that because you have to pick your hard. Like, I think it's in Big Magic, Elizabeth Gilbert talks about like, like everyone in their job has to like eat a shit sandwich at some point, and as a writer you just decide what's the shit sandwich that I'm gonna eat and like when. So it's like
Yeah.
basically what you just said. So in any case, I was working on this essay, and I had a topic that I pitched to the editor. She loved it. We were like, great. And then it's like I sort of have to write for a long time before I figure out what I'm trying to say. Like it just like I sort of write into it, and then it comes together like very quickly, but it just takes me a while like to decide like what is it that I'm trying to say. And like the thought you were saying before of like I know I can fix it, like I had this thought of like I know how this works now. Like I just write for a long time and it seems like it's terrible and it's never going to come together. And then like one day I have an idea and it's like everything kind of gels together. And I'm like, so I just have to get to that point. But it was really helpful to have had enough experience to be like, oh, this is just part of it. This is not me like wasting time or like it's not that I don't know what I'm doing. It's just that like this is actually my process. So sort of like owning it was really helpful to me.
Yeah, if you identify what your process is, it makes the rest so much easier. And there really does come a point where you just write the way that you do. There is no correct way to do it. I think
Mm.
we're always fascinated. My friend calls it um, OPP, other people's process. We think someone else has got the process figured out, and if we only
Yes.
their way, then the whole thing would be easier. But it doesn't work
Yes.
like
Oh my God,
which is
that's so funny.
also why I tell people if you find a book on writing that speaks to you and it
Mm.
makes sense, stop reading books on writing and just do the one that makes sense to you. It's like
Mm.
continuing to look at wedding dresses after you've bought one. You'll only be miserable. So I have a book that works for me. I understand it. It's kind of, I
Mm.
revisit it every time I start a novel to kind of jumpstart the plotting process.
Mm.
And I don't read any other writing books because I don't need to.
Which book is it? Would you share?
I will share. It will melt your brain and you'll probably hate it, but I love it. It's called The Anatomy of Story by John Truby. The
Okay.
subtitle is 22 Steps to Become a Master Storyteller. I
Ooh.
say you might hate it because it's very intense and he requires your full attention. You kind of work through all of these different steps. The
Mm-hmm.
reason I like it is it's not about plotting per se, it's more storytelling. What makes a story? And you begin with your idea and then you go, okay, how can I best tell this idea? What is the best structure? What is the best narrator? And he really forces you to think creatively every single time. There's
Mm-hmm.
no fill in the blank, which is part of why every single one of my novels has had a very different structure. I've approached it with tense and narration and structure. They've all been different because that particular book has helped me look at my idea and go, ooh, what is the best way to tell this story?
Yeah.
And I'm
I love that. And I love sort of like the constraint of like for you, you're like, this book works for me. I'm gonna use it over and over and over. And I think sometimes like there is this piece where you're saying about OPP, like other people's process, where like people use that I found as like a procrastination tool
yeah,
of like, oh, I just haven't found the process yet, right? It's just like you just go get back to work. Like
kind of
it's
like
just
the debates between writing between Word and Scrivener. I write in Scrivener and until it's the editing process, and then I transfer everything to Word because that's just
Mhm.
industry standard. But I have so many friends that write in Word, and then halfway through a book, they're like, "Oh, I'm going to switch to Scrivener because it'll make it easier." It won't make anything easier. It's just
Yeah.
a tool. It's a computer program. It can't do it for you. But I'm guilty of this. I'm constantly looking for ways to make it easier. And once you make peace with the fact that it is work, it is a craft. They call it the
Mm.
craft of writing for a
Yes.
reason. You have to hone your craft, and it's every day.
Yep, every day. I love that. What words of wisdom do you have to offer to writers that are just starting out?
The best thing I can say, because I have to tell myself this every time I start a book, is finish the book. There's no career without the book. There is no publication without the book. There is no agent. There is no editor. There is nothing without a finished manuscript. There are no shortcuts and there's no easy way in. But if you have a finished manuscript, you can make it better. You can make it great. You can sell it. You can have a career. You can see the book on the bookshelves. But none of that exists without finished manuscript. And that is always the key. It's the hardest part of the whole process. but also the most fulfilling thing in the world to hold a stack of printed pages and know that you did it. You took nothing and you turned it into something. And now here's a thing that exists in the world because you did the hard work.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I love that so much. So thank you so much. This has been like the most fun conversation ever. So I really
Oh, thank
appreciate
you
you
for having
being
me.
part of it. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. Go grab your copy of Codename Helene. It's out everywhere in paperback February 2nd, 2021. You will not be disappointed. Make sure you subscribe to the channel for tips on how to write your book, and I'll see you next time.